the new Mass. How you pray is how you live, is how you believe. In study after study, Catholics have become Protestant in their views of theology and morality. According to CBS News, 70% do not believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. This is of Catholics. Over 90% reject the Church's teaching on contraception. Catholics are simply indistinguishable from the rest of America in the rates in which they abort, divorce, and cohabit. Poll after poll shows that Catholic youth under the age of 30 may be more pro-life than their parents are, but they are decidedly more accepting of homosexuality. Half of all Catholic high schools in America, half, have closed since 1965. Half. The number of Catholics between 18 and 30 that attend Mass each week has simply disappeared. Less than 5% of Catholics between the ages of 18 and 30 go to Mass. 95% of that group doesn't go to Mass. And for people who want to sit back and say, oh, don't be so concerned about those numbers, they'll get married, they'll have children, when that happens, they come back. No, they don't. A very recent poll was just conducted about a month and a half ago that says, you know what? That's a fairy tale. They do not come back. They do not come back. Marriage, kids, does not bring them back to the church. You could simply ask yourselves, well, if they grew up in all of this, and if they're under 30, they did, what would they feel this great pressing need to come back to? There's no denying that since the new Mass, the Church, in its Catholic character, in its public worship and living out of the faith by the laity, has simply been wiped off the map. So devastated has the faith become that when he was still Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI said the Church may simply have to become smaller and live in isolated little pockets like it did back in the beginning centuries of the Church. In fact, in 1997, he said, I am convinced that the crisis in the Church that we are experiencing is to a large extent due to the disintegration of the liturgy. When the community of faith, the worldwide unity of the Church and her history, and the mystery of the living Christ are no longer visible in the liturgy, where else then is the Church to become visible in her spiritual essence? Then the community is celebrating only itself, an activity that is utterly fruitless. What's he describing? He's describing Protestant services. That's what he's describing, where you just get together and kind of celebrate yourself. Let's recall again how all of this came about. This is the mechanism, how all of these changes came into the Mass. In the course of review now, in 1960, Bonini is appointed secretary to the Preparatory Commission, responsible for drafting the documents that will be presented to the full council. In his role, he draws up his schema, the Bonini schema, which is accepted by the Commission. Bonini's schema is then presented to the Council Fathers, who vote to accept it in December of 1963. Once official, its name changes from the so-called Bonini schema to Sacrosanctum Concilium, the first document of Vatican II. In 1964, the Concilium was established, the body, the group that was in charge of this, was established to implement Sacrosanctum Concilium. This was the body that Bonini was in charge of. Remember now, the document is the same one that he had written and drawn up himself 2 years earlier. Now, secretary to this body, he would also have oversight in implementing it and it being promulgated to the world. That's how this whole thing happened. This dual role of writing the document in 1962, which is eventually accepted by the Council Fathers, and then interpreting and implementing it starting in 1964, prompted one cardinal from England, John Heenan, to say, God forbid that the people who wrote the document would also be the ones who advanced it. But that is exactly what in fact did happen. In 1967, after a series of small incremental changes, Bonini unveils his vision for the new Mass to a synod of bishops in the Sistine Chapel right under Michelangelo's glorious frescoes. He unveils his Mass. Here it is, folks. We've had the Tridentine Mass, but here is the Bonini Mass. And reports are that this Mass was so repulsive and so disturbing that more than half of the bishops simply got up and walked out of the Mass. Precise changes that they found to be so disturbing It's kind of a matter of debate. If you read through all of these things in different articles, you'll hear this, and then somebody will say, well, no, it wasn't this, it was that. But the point was, no one challenges the fact that a huge number of bishops got up and walked out and said, whoa, this isn't Mass. This isn't the Mass that we know. This isn't even close to it. What we do know is that there was this huge consternation and upset about what he did actually change. One bishop made these comments when he finished asking Bugnini about his radical changes. This bishop said he, Bugnini, spoke absolutely as if there had never been a Mass in the church before him. He spoke of his normative Mass as a new invention. Those comments were later echoed by people like Cardinal Ratzinger when he said, in the place of liturgy as the fruit of development came fabricated liturgy. We abandoned the organic living process of growth and development over the centuries and replaced it, as in a manufacturing process, with a fabrication, a banal on-the-spot product. Look who's making these comments. Despite all the various objections, when it came time to being voted on by the bishops, it was passed. 71 bishops voted to approve, 43 voted not approved. That's hardly a ringing endorsement. And 62 approved with reservations, some of them very serious reservations. Nonetheless, after this, 2 years later, and this is the Mass that they saw inside the Sistine Chapel in 1967. 2 years later, in 1969, on April 3rd, Pope Paul VI officially promulgates this Mass, the Bugnini Mass, with little to no changes to the one presented in the Sistine Chapel. The official document is called the Apostolic Constitution on the New Roman Missal and was the groundwork for the Mass we see today in all of our regular parishes. Archbishop Bugnini crowed about this in 1974. He said, the liturgical reform is a major conquest of the Catholic Church, and it has ecumenical dimensions, since the other churches and Christian denominations see in it not only something to be admired in itself, but equally as a sign of further progress to come. Notice what he says here, since the other churches and Christian denominations, there is no such thing as other churches. And we, the Catholic Church, are not one of a number of denominations. Protestant ecclesial communities are denominations. We are not. We are the original church that goes back to Jesus Christ himself, founded on Peter. This is an archbishop equating Protestant groups that he's incorrectly calling churches with the Catholic Church, as though, oh, now we're all the same and we can all get together and hold hands and do our stuff together. And he's wrong. And Pope Benedict XVI, when he was still the head of CDF, corrected this understanding that we're all churches. No, there is one church. Our Blessed Lord founded one church, and it's the Catholic Church. Everything else is an ecclesial community. But there's more. The wording of this document is so vague in many places, and some people think it was deliberately written that way, that they actually accuse Bugnini of making it vague so that people could come around later and interpret it whatever way they wanted to. That not only the theology behind it is questionable, but the various implementations can be considered vague and open to wild interpretations. Now, Cardinal John Heenan, again, the same one who said, oh, please don't let the people who wrote this be the ones who implemented it. He said, he was Archbishop of Westminster, by the way, he said of the document, a determined group could wear down opposition and produce a formula patient of both an orthodox and a modernistic interpretation. Yeah, boy, did those words come true. It was precisely because of all of this ambiguity and room for interpretation that many viewed the changes as a threat to the faith of Catholics in the pews. And this is where a cardinal named Alfredo Ottaviani, as well as another cardinal, Antonio Bacci, became so alarmed they produced their own document and presented it to Pope Paul VI just as the changes were starting to be made. His documents become known as the Ottaviani intervention, like, whoa, stop, I want to intervene here. You need to read this, Holy Father, you need to read this. It's a blistering analysis of Bugnini's Mass. It stresses the point that the new Mass is a severe rupture from the past with its overemphasis on community, as well as a wild accommodation of Protestant theology. The Mass, for example, in Bugnini's document is constantly referred to as a supper. In fact, it is defined by Bugnini as a supper, in his document at the expense of the idea of sacrifice. In the area of the purpose for the Mass, the ultimate purpose for the Mass is the sacrifice of praise rendered to the Holy Trinity. That's the ultimate purpose. The ordinary purpose of the Mass is to make satisfaction to God for sin. That's what Catholic theology has always maintained. But these purposes don't even appear in the Bonini schema or anything. They don't. Those distinctions aren't even there. Those purposes don't even exist. The new Mass stresses the nourishment and the sanctification of the faithful. Old Mass, worship and adoration to the Holy Trinity, the removal of sin. Here, hey, we're all nourished and getting along together. Two entirely different structures here. The intervention takes special exception, as a matter of fact. Ottaviani's intervention takes special exception to the term bread of life and spiritual drink. As in, blessed are you, Lord, God of all creation, through your goodness, we have this bread or wine to offer. It will become for us the bread of life or our spiritual drink. Those two expressions, according to the intervention, are so utterly vague, they could mean anything. In fact, with the reduction of the Mass from a sacrifice to a supper, this is a quote from the intervention, with its de-emphasis on the sacrificial nature and overemphasis on the community, the Mass will turn into a philanthropist's meeting or a charity banquet. That was Cardinal Ottaviani's analysis or assessment of the Novus Ordo. The language used in the new Mass confuses nearly every aspect of the Mass. The idea of sacrifice, who's actually offering the sacrifice. The understanding now in so many Catholic parishes is that we all offer the sacrifice as a community. No, we don't. That's what the priest does. That's why the priest is a priest. The idea of an altar versus a table. Come up around the table of the Lord. Remember that song in the 60s? Gather round the table of the Lord. Yeah, I know that'll be the last time I do that. The total absence of the word transubstantiation. With all of these confusions, the very nature of the faith itself is undermined. This is what Ottaviani was stressing. So the former theology is largely dismissed and substituted. But the question is, what is it substituted with? When that old theology, the Catholic theology, is gone, something else is brought in. What is the something else? That's what we're going to talk about when we come back. We're going to have on stage a very, very knowledgeable priest who knows an awful lot about this and is going to sit and ask him a few questions, and we'll hear his responses to what's going on with the Mass. We'll be right back right after this.